Coronavirus, so far as we know, has no views about Brexit. Sadly, so far, coronavirus has not been spotted walking down Downing Street carrying a box of its possessions on the way home. Like Dominic Cummings, however, coronavirus has struggled up close and personal with the Prime Minister. But the real problem for Boris Johnson this morning, and frankly for the rest of us, isn't Mr Cummings or infighting in number 10, with infections sharply up and the winter just getting started. It is, as every week, coronavirus. With that in mind, I'm delighted to say we're going to be hearing from Uğur Şahin, one half of the medical marriage that's brought the world a workable vaccine. And to give perspective about the struggle between vaccine and virus, Professor Wendy Barclay, one of the world's leading virologists. But we are not ignoring the politics. I'm joined by the Cabinet Minister George Eustice to answer the most important question about the departure of Dominic Cummings, whether it changes in any way the government's approach to the Brexit talks. By the Shadow Culture Secretary, Joe Stevens. And giving his perspective on rifts in number 10, the future for the economy and his Scottish homeland, the former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. So that's a lot to get through, and I apologise in advance if some of our interviews this morning are a little shorter than normal. Reviewing this quite extraordinary week's news, we have Camilla Tominey of the Daily Telegraph and our very own hard-working Vicki Young. Before that, the news with Seema Katecha.
Morning, Andrew. Labour are calling for social media companies to face tough financial and criminal penalties if they fail to clamp down on anti-vaccine content. With a coronavirus vaccine on the way, Labour wants the government to bring in emergency laws to deal with what they describe as dangerous online material. Ministers say they're working closely with social media firms to combat the problem. An extra £40 million has been allocated to schemes that boost conservation in England. The government says the funding will support existing jobs and help create new ones. Ministers also want to give parts of the countryside greater protection by designating them as national parks or areas of outstanding natural beauty. Green campaigners have welcomed the cash but say more is needed. Tens of thousands of people have marched in Washington, D.C. to support President Donald Trump's unsubstantiated claims of election fraud. Later, counter-protesters also took to the streets and fireworks were thrown between rival groups of demonstrators. Mr. Trump has so far refused to concede to President-elect Joe Biden. Around 2.5 million households in the UK are worried about paying their rent over the winter, with 700,000 already in arrears and 350,000 at risk of eviction. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation conducted a survey which found that many households are building up unimaginable amounts of unpaid rent because of the pandemic. The government says it's supporting tenants in need whilst also ensuring landlords have access to justice in the most serious cases. Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall are in Berlin, where they'll welcome the first senior British royals to take part in Germany's annual remembrance ceremonies. The Prince of Wales is expected to use a speech at the German Parliament to urge nations to stand up against intolerance and strive for a better tomorrow. That's all from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Very many thanks, Seema. And now to the front pages. The Sunday Express, which is a Brexit-supporting paper, is worried, clearly, that after the explosive events of the last few days in Downing Street, the Prime Minister is going to go wobbly on Brexit. It says, "Hold your nerve, Boris," as its front page piece. But then there's all the detail. The Observer, attacks by the Prime Minister's ousted aide, left the new press chief in tears, it says. The Sunday Mirror has a very offensive comment about the Prime Minister's other half or significant other. The Mail on Sunday, their main story is about this new TV series from Netflix, the latest part of The Crown, and the fury of the palace about that. And I have to say, having seen some of it myself, I can see why senior members of the royal family might be upset. But they're covering the Dominic Cummings story, snobbery, sexism and smears. Number 10 war gets even nastier, it says. The Sunday Times has a very interesting story here about lobbyists getting special access. That's a company called Portland. And the Sunday Telegraph, Downing Street slams vicious and cowardly attacks on Simmons. That's Carrie Simmons, the Prime Minister's partner. So I'm joined by Camilla and by Vicki. Vicki, it's a day where all the kind of gory and extraordinary detail of this kind of war inside Downing Street is splashed across the papers. Two questions. Who are these people and why do they matter?
And that's a very good question, because many people watching this will be thinking that the government should be focusing on those losing their lives, not losing their jobs, I think. But it is important because, yes, we've all seen power struggles before, particularly around advisors in number 10. But this is about decision making. These people are making decisions every hour of every day about things that matter to us and people watching at home. So it's important how they make those decisions and who they are. And when you talk about who they are, well, some people would have heard of Dominic Cummings, of course.
I saw him described as the most important advisor to a British Prime Minister ever in one of the papers today.
Yeah, I mean, he's been incredibly influential, not just because he helped deliver Brexit and ran that campaign, of course, as part of Vote Leave. And it's him and Lee Kane who worked alongside him on that. They then came into Downing Street alongside Boris Johnson. Now, I remember you and I sitting on the morning of the general election in a studio not far from here, talking about that transfer from campaigning to governing, and they're different things. And I think this has been part of the problem. There has been trouble brewing in Downing Street, not just this week, but for quite some time, about the approach taken, particularly by Dominic Cummings, seen as very aggressive by many, picking fights rather than building alliances.
There's a sort of element, a hint of sexism in some of the front pages this morning. To what extent has this been a fight back by some very powerful women around Boris Johnson against a kind of lads' club?
Well, I think there's definitely an element, because we have a new press secretary, Allegra Stratton. She's come into number 10. There's talk of tension there. And then there is the role of Carrie Simons, the fiancée of the Prime Minister. Now, it's not just a partner talking to their partner about things. Carrie Simons worked for the Conservative Party at quite a senior level.
She knows the party inside out, doesn't she?
She knows the party. She has an allegiance to the party, which some say Dominic Cummings has never had. And of course, she wants Boris Johnson to do well. So there's that element of it. She has a lot of friends, but there has been briefing against her. She's been called various things in the papers today. She's been referred to me as Lady Macbeth up in the flat on her WhatsApp. And this has been seen as many people as a very personal attack on her.
It's quite a feud. Camilla Tominey, you've been covering this all the week for the Telegraph. It's being portrayed as a kind of soap opera, and the extraordinary detail that is pouring into the newspapers has a few jaws on the floor this morning.
It does, really. I mean, all of these briefings coming from all sides and involving some quite divisive figures. Yes, we've got Cummings, and he's depicted in the Sunday Times there as the third person in the marriage of the Johnsons. Then, of course, all of this coverage of Carrie. We've seen that echoed in the past, haven't we, with the idea of figures like Sherry Blair interfering into government matters. But again, this has come down to this classic historical story about who has the Prime Minister's ear and who is close to him. And I think this disbanding of this Vote Leave sort of cabal, this idea of a laddish culture around the Prime Minister, into a new era heralded by the introduction of another woman, Allegra Stratton, ex-ITV journalist, who's going to become the press secretary, who seems to have been instrumental in all of this, does seem to suggest a sort of mellowing perhaps of the Johnson administration after what has been a pretty chaotic 12 months, let's face it.
Camilla, let me ask you, your old paper, The Express, is clearly very, very worried that this all means a change of direction on Brexit. And in terms of policy, that is probably the single biggest issue. Does the departure of Dominic Cummings mean the government's going to change in any way at all on Brexit? What's your view?
It's a good question because, of course, Cummings was instrumental in the referendum result and subsequently holding MPs' feet to the flames when it came to getting that Brexit deal through by some miracle at the end of last year. And that's why we assume that he was given so much power, because Johnson thanks him not only for Brexit, but for delivering that 80-seat majority on the back of the slogan, get Brexit done. He has to get it done politically. Interestingly, there's a piece in The Observer saying of all of the people in his team, he is the hardest Brexiteer on this. Yeah. He doesn't want a relinquishing of the negotiations. And it's noteworthy, isn't it, that despite some suggestions that they might resign, both David Frost, who's his EU Sherpa, and Oliver Lewis, who is the Brexit policy guy, are remaining in number 10, at least until the Brexit transition period ends, because they want to make sure that the negotiation remains as robust as it has been in recent weeks.
I think that's a very shrewd spot. For the moment, Camilla, thanks very much. Vicki, on cue, it's more than about the pantomime. There's Michael Howard, Lord Howard, now former Conservative leader and long-term Brexiteer himself, writing in the Mail, I think, there.
Yeah, and very keen to talk about the future and how this might change the Downing Street operation. We're saying there about policy. Will it change policy? Will it change tone? And he's particularly picking up on something that we've all seen, which is how really MPs, backbenchers, the cabinet very much sidelined over the last year under this operation. And he's saying that has to change, that lots of the problems that they've encountered have been because MPs aren't being consulted. There's particular concern, the new intake representing those seats in the north of England, they want more input. There's talk today of new policy groups and then of going back to a cabinet-style government where they actually make decisions rather than just rubber stamping what's been told to them by Dominic Cummings.
I can remember exactly the same argument going on in the Blair years about is cabinet taken seriously enough and all the rest of it. But there are some very, very effective senior Conservatives now on the backbenches, having been expelled from the system. I'm thinking of people like Jeremy Hunt, I'm thinking of Sajid Javid, Tom Tugendhat and others. Do you think we're going to see a reshaping of the cabinet, perhaps early in the new year, to bring in a wider range of people?
Yeah, I mean, there's talk of a cabinet reshuffle now. Which of those people might be brought back is another matter. Sajid Javid was talked about as a chief of staff, actually. That's what they're really looking for, someone to be at the centre of this. He, I think, has made it known that he probably won't be doing that. But yeah, I think a lot of people feel that the cabinet were appointed for loyalty. They were appointed in case of a no-deal Brexit, and that might well not be the case come January, and it's time to refresh that and maybe bring in some new talent. So things could change. The tone, I think, will definitely change, likely to be much more towards compromise.
We read, I don't know if it's true, that Dominic Cummings is working from home on this so-called moonshot project. Do you think these changes are going to have any impact at all on the way the government handles coronavirus?
I think that's not as likely. I mean, I think what is said about Dominic Cummings is that actually he couldn't do everything. He tried to do everything. And in the end, he was very much focused on the moonshot, the mass testing. And that's why he is going to continue to work from home until December, because you can't just leave government overnight when you've been that influential. And there are friends of his who say, look, if that works, if the mass testing, that rapid turnaround, if that really does work, that will be very much down to him and his legacy. Now, whether it's the other approach changes very much, I'm not so sure.
Camilla, can I ask you about, there's a lot of people around Boris Johnson, going back to the time when he was London Mayor, who said this is going to herald the return of the kind of friendly, open, liberal, softer-edged Boris that we used to know. Do you think that's in any way likely, or do you think that's a fantasy?
Well, I think Tory MPs certainly hope so. They feel that he hasn't been played to his strengths. Interestingly there, you mentioned his City Hall career. Actually, if memory serves, the first 6 to 12 months of his administration in London were an absolute disaster. I think he lost about 12 key advisors, reinstated a new team and managed to turn things around.
Oh, so I think
yes, some of the old faces from City Hall might be popping back again in number 10, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you finally about this story on the front page of the Mail on Sunday about The Crown, because this is a very glossy, beautifully made, very popular television series, series after series after series, and it's now coming up to more recent times, the Diana story, the death of Lord Mountbatten, and a lot of focus on the Prince of Wales. And the royal family are very, very upset. We read.
Well, indeed. It says that they think that the Netflix drama has been trolling on a Hollywood budget, which is awkward, is it, when you consider that Harry and Meghan have just signed a multi-million-pound deal with Netflix. But yes, they think it depicts Prince Charles particularly in an overly negative light. They've got Penny Junor, the respected royal author, here commenting on the fact that effectively these characters have become complete caricatures and that it's completely one-sided. Having said that, I think Peter Morgan, its creator, has always said that it is a drama, not a documentary, and that a degree of poetic license has been used.
It's a very powerful drama, but if you were, as it were, Princess Camilla, if you were sitting in Buckingham Palace and you were watching this, you'd be pretty horrified, wouldn't you?
Do you know what? They've been long horrified. I think the first series, they were very angry about the depiction of Prince Philip being unfeeling about the death of his sisters. I also heard that Lord Snowdon was very put out by the depiction of Princess Margaret as this kind of, heavy drinking good time girl. So I don't think they've been happy with this from start to finish, but that's probably why people like watching it so much.
The power of television. Camilla Tominey and Vicki Young, thank you both very much indeed. Both very, very hard-working people this week and have come in, so thanks to them for that. Now to the weather. Blow winds and crack your cheeks. Spout till you have drenched our steeple. Who's there besides foul weather? Well, luckily for us, the answer is Sarah Keith-Lucas, safe and warm in her studio. Sarah.
Good morning to you, Andrew. Well, the weather is certainly causing us a few headaches out there today. We've got low pressure driving things, bringing not just some heavy rain, but also some really strong winds, especially in the south. This is the view looking over the English Channel from St Leonard's on Sea this morning. So we've got more wet weather to come, more strong winds through today, particularly to the southern half of this area of low pressure. That's where we've got all the isobars on the map, the strongest of the winds and weather fronts. There's also been a lot of heavy rain already across the southeast of England and East Anglia. That first batch of rain clears away and then we're left with some drier intervals, but plenty of showers rattling around that area of low pressure. And these are some of the gusts of wind we're likely to see, even inland up to about 45 miles per hour. But around the coast, certainly stronger than that. So the wind's strong enough for some disruption. With high spring tides at the moment too, there could be some coastal flooding with those high tides combined with the strong winds. Now into this evening and tonight we keep the breezy conditions, not as windy as it is through the day today. Still a few showers lingering overnight, but it's frost-free with temperatures holding up between about 5 to 9 degrees first thing tomorrow morning. Now tomorrow brings a bit of a quieter day compared to today. It's still breezy, but some drier weather, especially in the east. The cloud increases from the west later in the day. There'll be more rain arriving across Northern Ireland, Wales and the southwest of England by the end of the day. It also turns a little bit cooler than it has been recently, and it stays pretty unsettled through the middle of the week. Andrew.
Sounds like King Lear needs a sixth act. Now, before we inoculate ourselves from COVID-19, do we need to inoculate ourselves from misinformation about vaccines? The Labour Party's got something to say about that. Jo Stevens is the Shadow Culture Secretary and she joins me now from Cardiff. Welcome, Jo Stevens. Can you explain to people watching what your proposal is to deal with anti-vax propaganda?
So we are calling on the government this morning to introduce urgent legislation to combat the tsunami of anti-vax information, disinformation that's online that is harmful and that is having an effect and will have an effect on the efficacy of the rollout of the vaccine. So what we want the government to do is bring forward legislation that will put an onus on social media companies to be able to identify dangerous anti-vax content, to stop it going onto their platforms. But if they don't stop it going onto the platforms, to have systems in place to remove it once it's on there as quickly as possible.
Right.
And then if there are breaches of that regulation, because obviously, you know, social media companies are the only area that are unregulated. We have regulation for broadcast media, we have it for print media. If there are continuous breaches, that there are proper sanctions, financial penalties that are meaningful in terms of the size of these huge global companies, but also criminal penalties if there's aggravated and persistent breaches, so personal liability on senior directors.
I suppose what I'm struggling to understand is why this is necessary, because the government has actually sat down with the big social media companies and come to an agreement, and they have said that they commit to the principle that no user or company should directly profit from COVID-19 vaccine misinformation. In other words, they are getting on top of the trouble already, aren't they?
They're not getting on top of the trouble, and there's plenty of evidence out there from research groups that have been looking specifically into this issue. We know, and the social media companies themselves have admitted, that self-regulation doesn't work. The government promised over 18 months ago to bring forward legislation on online harms, which they failed to do so, and the latest indications that we have are that legislation may not be in place until 2024. Now, the agreement reached with the social media companies last week is only for them to remove content that is flagged to them by the government that is creating profit for them, that they are promoting. Now, I asked the government to tell me how many reports they had flagged to social media companies through their counter-disinformation unit, and the answer I got was that they would refuse to tell me. So there's no transparency about this. We don't know what they're doing, and we know from past experience that social media companies promise the earth and very rarely deliver.
Now, we know there's a very large range of opinion about vaccines, and it ranges from people who think the world's run by sort of shape-shifting lizards and so forth, and that there's a massive conspiracy to force people to have vaccines at one end of the scale. But there's also an awful lot of people who look at how quickly these vaccines are being developed, and with all due regard to the scientists involved, are not quite sure that they're absolutely safe. Are you proposing to, as it were, treat both groups the same, to criminalise both groups?
No. And the criminalising aspect is simply about aggravated failure to abide by legislation once introduced on senior executives of social media companies. This is not about criminalising individual members of the public. What we know is if you go onto a search engine now and you type in anti-vax campaign, you will get thousands of references to anti-vax groups, some of which have, tens of thousands of members, and the spreading of harmful content on these platforms is causing a problem.
So what about the individuals going on to online forums and spreading anti-vax arguments? Maliciously or otherwise? Are you going to do anything about the individuals promoting these arguments?
We're calling for legislation to put the onus on the social media companies. We know already that they can remove content. They do it already in terms of illegal content. Okay. And they have the technical expertise, they have the resources, they have the money to be able to do this. Facebook's motto, move fast and break things. Facebook's motto now should be move fast and fix things because something has gone very wrong. All
right, but you're not going to be criminalising or coming after people marching up and down the streets of Westminster or Whitehall protesting about vaccines, whatever their slogans are.
Not at all, no. There are public order laws already in place to deal with that.
Aren't they the most dangerous people, though? Aren't they the most dangerous ones?
Not necessarily. I mean, we think that there should be regulation in place to cover social media companies. As I say, there are regulations, laws in place covering broadcast media and print media, and social media has a much bigger reach. You're talking about platforms that facilitate the spreading of information, good and bad, to billions of people across the globe. They have a reach that no other broadcaster or print media outfit does.
Neither of us, certainly. Joe Stevens, thanks very much for coming into the studio and talking to us this morning. Now then, 11 months ago, we'd never even heard of COVID-19. But earlier this week, the news broke that we've got a vaccine that, so far at least, is promising to be more effective than anyone could have dreamed. The wonder of science. It was created by the husband and wife team, Uğur Şahin and Eustice MP, who run BioNTech. I spoke to Mr. Şahin yesterday, and I began by asking him when we will know that the vaccine is safe to use.
What we are seeing so far indicates that the vaccine has a typical vaccine-associated side effect profile. That means the people who receive the vaccine have pain in the injection site for a few days, which is mild to moderate, and a proportion of the participants who receive the vaccine has fever, also for 1 to 2 days, and the fever is also mild to moderate. These are the key side effects that we have seen, and we did not see any other serious side effects which would result in pausing or halting of the study. We have now safety data for a proportion of the subjects for more than two months, and we are continuing to collect this data for more than 2 years to really not only to see the short and midterm side effect profile, but also the long-term side effect profile. But so far, the safety profile appears to be absolutely benign.
Will your vaccine be able to be used in combination with, for instance, the AstraZeneca vaccine and others?
So at the beginning, it does not make sense to combine vaccines. And so every vaccine has been clinically evaluated as a prime boost. So that means most vaccines are based on a first injection, and after 3 weeks or after four weeks, a second injection. And I wouldn't mix that because this has not been evaluated for safety. But if after 1 year, for example, if someone who has received an AstraZeneca vaccine, and who does not anymore have an immune response, then it could be combined with a BioNTech Pfizer vaccine or vice versa.
Do we know how long the immunity lasts after the second dose?
We don't know. So we need to collect this data. We can, at the moment, only extrapolate some of the existing data. With this extrapolation, one can expect that the antibody response and the T-cell response, so it is well known that T-cell responses are very long-lived. So after people who, for example, had SARS infection more than 18 years ago have been identified having still T-cell responses. So the antibody response might decline over time, and we expect it will decline over time. But what is not known, how fast it will decline, and whether after 1 year, for example, sufficient antibody titers are still there. We are collecting this information, and we will see it. And if the antibody response, for example, after 1 year appeared to be too low, we can do a booster immunization, which should not be too complicated.
So we're all accustomed to getting annual flu jabs. Is it going to be more or less the same kind of thing, annual COVID-19 jabs in the years ahead?
Yeah, so the flu is a little bit different because with flu we are really dealing every year with a different strain or different strains. Yeah. So with the COVID-19, of course has some mutations, but so far the mutations are very distinct. And I don't expect that the virus will have a dramatic shift, which is observed, for example, for influenza. So the only reason for booster immunizations will be if we realize that there is no protection after 1 year. And we have to see that. It could be that it's immunization each year, every second year, or even every 5 years. So we really need to generate data to answer this question. We did not yet investigate the mutations which came from the minks. That will happen in the next 2 weeks. And I'm also confident that these mutations, because they are, even though there are several mutations, they are relatively small mutations, and we are confident that the broad immune response that we are generating by our immunogen would be able to inactivate even these variants, because 99% of the virus spike proteins remains still stable.
Now, clearly, you understand this vaccine better than anybody else. Is it as effective in older people as it is in younger people?
We have reported efficacy over 90%. So that means they, and we had in our clinical trial also elderly people was in the range of 35 to 40%. So I expect that it is also effective in elderly people, but I can't say at the moment how effective it is. We are now waiting for the final analysis, efficacy analysis of this trial, which will happen in the next 10 days to 3 weeks. And with this, we will have the full data set in 164 infected subjects. And then we can say how many of them were in elderly people in the control group, how many are in the vaccine group. And we can provide this information. It will just take another few weeks.
So here's the really big question that I don't understand at all. Does the vaccine simply stop symptoms in people with COVID-19, or does it stop the virus being spread?
I expect, so we did not formally answer these questions. We can indirectly answer this question in a few months by also evaluating, for example, antibodies in subjects in both groups, which are not directed against the immunogen, but against other proteins of the virus. That could give us an idea. Yeah. But as a scientist, and from extrapolation, what we have seen so far for other viruses, I would expect that a high efficacy in preventing disease translates into at least some efficacy in preventing infection. So I'm very confident and that transmission between people will be reduced by such a highly effective vaccine. Yeah? Maybe not 90%, but maybe 50%. But we should not forget that even that could result in a dramatic reduction of the pandemic spread.
Now, a week ago today, you were sitting there waiting for the phone call to tell you whether this vaccine worked, and if so, how effectively. Just tell us a little bit about the moment when the phone rang.
I knew that we will get a call at 8, providing us this answer. And I got the call from Albert Bohler, who is the CEO of Pfizer, and meanwhile also a good friend. And he called me and asked me if I would like to know if the trial is positive. And I said, no. But then I said, of course. And he said, sit down, yeah, and provided me the information that the trial is positive, and which was extremely relieving. As a scientist, you of course expect a certain likelihood that the trial could be positive based on the data we had so far, but there is always unknown factors. And it could be that there is a scientific, biological, or medical reason why the vaccine does not work. We now know that our vaccine works, and most likely other vaccines will also work. So this is really a message which not only changes the fate how we develop vaccines, but also increases the likelihood that we will be able to get this pandemic under control.
And how did you celebrate?
We did not have a lot of opportunity to celebrate. We just discussed the road. So I discussed that with my wife as dermatology, how fantastic this result is. It is an extraordinary result. We sit together and had a tea together and just recapitulated the last months until we got this data, and it is relieving, and of course it provides joy.
Well, of course, everyone in Britain will be delighted that you had a cup of tea to celebrate.
This is not only British, this is also Turkish.
Very good. Well, can this vaccine be adapted for other diseases, for instance, cancer?
Our main application for messenger RNA vaccines so far were in the cancer field, and is still in the cancer field. We're using messenger RNA vaccine to induce immune responses against tumor cells by identifying mutations and by identifying tumor antigens which are expressed in different tumors. These are clinical trials which are ongoing, and we are expecting clinical results, efficacy results in 2 years from now. And this could be, of course, also an exciting development.
That does sound very exciting. Meanwhile, President Trump has said that without his Operation Warp Speed, neither you nor Pfizer could have achieved that. Is that true?
We had decided from the very beginning to stay independent and to ensure that regardless what happens, that we are able to deliver the vaccine to any place on the planet where it is needed. And therefore we didn't get direct support from the Operation Warp Speed, but it was good to see how this was organized, and we of course ensured that there is a harmonization and compatibility of the clinical trial protocols that are used in the Operation Warp Speed and our operation, which is called Lightspeed.
Now, in this country, we had a yes, yes, yes moment when a leading academic said he thought we would be back to normal by the spring because of the vaccine. So what is your assessment? Will we be back to normal? And if so, when?
This winter will be hard. Yeah, so we will not have a big impact on the infection numbers with our vaccine in this winter. If everything continues to go well, we will start to deliver the vaccine end of this year, beginning next year. Our goal is to deliver more than 300 millions of vaccine doses until April next year, which could allow us to already start to make an impact. The bigger impact will happen until summer. Yeah, the summer will help us anyway because the infection rate will go down in summer. And what is absolutely essential is that we get a high vaccination rate until or before autumn, winter next year. So that means all the immunization vaccination approaches must be accomplished before next autumn. Yeah, and I'm confident that this will happen because there are a number of vaccine companies helping us to increase the supply and so that we could have a normal winter next year.
So that sounds like a lot of work ahead. So for you, I suppose, back to the laboratory, not to the beach or the yacht.
Yes. A little bit beach is also fine.
Mr. Şahin, thanks very much indeed for joining us, and congratulations from all of us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
You might almost say the man who saved the world. Now, back to politics. Meltdown in Downing Street, the triumph of Joe Biden, the future of the Union and how we pay the huge COVID bills. Is there anyone who can talk about all of these things? Indeed there is. I'm joined now by the former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. Mr Brown, welcome to the programme.
Good morning.
Can I ask you about the last few days? There's been extraordinarily explosive scenes in Downing Street. Now, those with us with a long memory can remember, if I could put it this way, slight percussive moments during your time. Have you any friendly advice or other advice to offer the Prime Minister at the moment about how to reset now?
Well, you've got 27,000 new cases yesterday, 500 deaths. You've got 1 million young people looking for work. You've got people without savings planning for Christmas. Really, we should not be in this factional fighting at the moment. And I see no end to this factional fighting because you've got a soft Brexit faction, a hard Brexit faction, you've got a libertarian faction in relation to health restrictions, a communitarian faction, you've got a northern faction wanting spending rises, a southern faction wanting spending cuts. You've got a devolution faction and a centralisation faction. This is not simply a problem of a dysfunctional Downing Street. This is a dysfunctional UK, and we really will need a wholesale root and branch constitutional review to bring people together at a later stage. For the moment, we've got to get the government back to working on the issues that really matter.
You mentioned Brexit. Do you think the departure of Dominic Cummings has any effect on how the government is going to deal with these trade talks in the last few days?
I think the arrival of Joe Biden has made all the difference. I see a trade deal coming pretty soon. The government simply cannot afford to be at war with America on the one hand and Europe on the other at the start of the new year. So if he doesn't change his internal market bill, he's at war with America. If he doesn't get a negotiation settled with Europe, he's at war with Europe. I think he's made up his mind already that he's going to get a settlement, and there will be a settlement soon, I think.
Now, you've known Joe Biden for quite a long time, but isn't it the case that a Biden administration will be just as tough on a trade deal with the UK as a Trump one might have been? And Joe Biden comes from Delaware, where all the chicken farmers are. He's not going to be easy on us, is he?
Yeah, but there'll be no trade deal if we break the Good Friday Agreement, and that's the essential element that is really at risk from the internal market bill. And I think Joe Biden will be very strong on saying, look, if you put the Northern Ireland settlement at risk, then you're putting any trade deal in jeopardy, absolutely. So yes, there's bound to be creative tension about what you have in a trade deal, but there may be no trade deal at all if there's no settlement of the based on the Good Friday Agreement.
Now, you mentioned a fractured union. A lot of people in London, a lot of the politicians in London have been quite slow to notice the really quite interesting rise in support for independence in Scotland, particularly among younger voters. What's your advice to them?
Well, you know, it's not just a Scottish problem now, and it's not even just a Welsh problem and a Scottish problem. You see the revolt of the regions around the United Kingdom. They feel they're not listened to, the government doesn't consult, they've got the local knowledge, but they don't have the resources. The government's got the resources, but not the local knowledge. This is now a UK problem. I think before we look at what's going to happen to Scotland in the future, we've got to consider whether the virus and the economic damage has really forced onto the agenda, right up to the surface, what kind of United Kingdom we're actually wanting. What is the relationship between the local areas and the centre? Can you manage public health without having a good process of consultation? Can you manage what the economic fallout is without consulting with the regions and with the nations? And I think this centralised unitary state, you cannot straitjacket a multinational country and diverse regions into a centralised unitary state as they've been trying to do.
The leader of your party, Sir Keir Starmer, said back in January that if the SNP won well in next year's Holyrood elections, then he said they have a mandate for an independence referendum. I accept this. This is a question for Scotland. And then just back in September, he said those issues are questions for Scotland. I do stand by that. What would you say to Keir Starmer this morning?
Well, the question at the moment is not whether you could have a referendum. The question is whether you should have a referendum. We're in the middle of a virus. We're in the middle of a recession. We've got huge problems, and we can't have there's a time to heal, and there's got to be a time to heal. before you go into any divisive, conflicting referendum that really will cause consternation in Scotland for months and months to come. I see the SNP leader this morning is saying there's got to be a referendum in 2021. Now, I think most Scottish people will make up their mind that in the middle of a virus, when you've got to heal the virus, you've got to heal the recession, and you've got to look at the whole future of Britain.
Okay.
And the SNP, of course, have got to come clean about what it now means for independence, now that you've got economic changes taking place. I don't think this is the right time at all.
What about the democratic principles, however? Because Keir Starmer has said there should be a referendum if the SNP win, and Mark Drakeford, who leads the party in Wales, says if a population in Scotland, or indeed Wales, wanted to hold a referendum, it's for the people of Wales and the people of Scotland to make that decision. No Labour leader should argue that the component parts of the United Kingdom can be prevented from navigating a future for themselves. That decision must be respected.
Yeah, but that's not the issue, Andrew, at the moment. The issue is, should you have a referendum in the middle of a virus, in the middle of unemployment, in the middle of when we're having to deal with the future of the United Kingdom? And I think we need a new plan for the future of the United Kingdom, as well as the SNP having to explain what their policies mean in this debt-laden world that we're now going to be in. Well, so this is not the right time. We need a time to heal.
You use the words debt-laden. I mean, you were in charge during the financial crisis of 2008, and now we're in a situation where debt is even higher than our GDP. At some point, it's going to have to be paid down. What's your thinking about how, going forward, Britain is going to pay down this massive debt?
Well, the only way forward is getting back to growth. I mean, austerity killed off growth in the United Kingdom economy, and it meant it was far more difficult to get the deficit and debt down. So you've got to get back to growth. Germany understands that, America understands that, Britain has got to understand that. Of course, it's a lot cheaper because interest rates are virtually nil to pay off your deficit and debt, but you cannot allow unemployment to rise on the altar of a new policy of austerity. You've got to do something about it. Otherwise, you lose capacity, skills, talents in the economy for good. You cannot allow tax rises to kill off an economic recovery at the moment.
If you lose the argument on a referendum, and there is a referendum, there's a great sort of after you, Claude, feeling on the union side. Nobody terribly wants to lead the unionist side in Scotland at the moment. Would you?
Well, I think there are many people who will lead the unionist campaign in Scotland, but I'm talking about an argument that is no longer now, I think, between the independence and the status quo. It's between independence, which is one form of change that I don't like, and the change that has really got to take place in the United Kingdom to bring us up to date. And we really are an out-of-date constitution trying to deal with modern, everyday problems. And when you have a debate about the constitution now, it's how you manage public health, how you manage welfare and social security, how you manage industry and employment, and you cannot continue with the centralist, unitary, man in Whitehall knows best formulas that we've used too often in the past. There's got to be not only devolution, but a devolution mindset.
Gordon Brown, on a sunny morning in Fife, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Now then, millions of mink are being culled in Denmark after a mutated form of the coronavirus was found in farmed animals. It's raised questions over the effectiveness of any vaccine we've been talking about this morning. I've been speaking to a world expert on virus mutation, Professor Wendy Barclay from Imperial College London, who sits on the government's SAGE committee. What impact on vaccines does she think these mutations will have?
These mutations that are in that spike protein, which is the piece on the outside of the virus, which is seen by our immune system, might affect the way antibodies see the virus. And crucially, it is the spike protein, which is the antigen, which is being included in the vaccines, the vast majority of vaccines that are being developed around the world. So the worry would be that if these mutations that are arising naturally in people or in animals, and then the virus coming back into people from animals, if they are affecting the way that antibodies can see the virus, maybe the vaccines which we're generating now won't work quite so well as we'd hope them to on the viruses as the virus continues to evolve.
But there have been suggestions that animals other than mink could be involved in the mutations.
Well, we'd only expect to see significant evolution in animals which are farmed densely, and that the mink are really housed together very closely, and that creates an environment where the virus can pass from one animal to the next, and mutant viruses which do better in that animal are very rapidly selected. The other animals which we know are susceptible to acquiring SARS-CoV-2 from humans are pets. There have been reports of cats and dogs, but those animals don't really live in such close conditions with each other. So I think it's less likely that we'll see mutant viruses arising in those and passing back into the human population than we would in a farmed animal. And most of the other farmed animals that have been looked at so far don't appear to be permissive for the virus. So this might turn out to be rather a sort of one-off situation.
Before everybody at home starts to clutch their heads and groan, is it not also the case that this is a sort of armaments race, in the sense the virus mutates and then the vaccines are tweaked in response and so on? It doesn't mean, in other words, that the vaccine won't work.
No, it doesn't mean vaccines won't work at all. And of course, that armament race that you've just described, the type of way that we deal with this problem, which is also a problem for vaccinating against influenza. So what's important here is if we think that this might be the case and we're going to have to enter into this race, then a vaccine platform which is very adaptable and fast responding could be the best of the different platforms that are being trialled out, because we might want to alter slightly the particular antigen, the particular spike that we include in future vaccines. But it's premature to suggest at the moment that that's going to be the case. We really do need to understand whether or not these mutations are significantly going to affect the way that the antibodies can work.
Again, you've been doing research which suggests that immunity declines most quickly in older people. Does that mean that the vaccines are least effective for the groups who actually need it most?
We have this issue called immunosenescence, where the immune system begins to fail as people get older. And that's a problem for all vaccines. Again, even the influenza vaccine doesn't work as well in elderly as we'd like it to. But I think we have to cling to hope here. And what we're really hoping is that this new generation of vaccines, which are coming forward for SARS-CoV-2, are going to be really robust and good vaccines and might work better even than the virus itself. So they might induce robust and long-lasting immunity, even in people whose immune system doesn't work terribly well against the virus.
So let me try to sum up. We need to keep a very close eye on the virus as it mutates, and that might mean further generations of vaccine have to be developed, and we need more data on how this affects older people in particular. So therefore, it isn't a magic bullet, but there is absolutely...
This week's announcement of the efficacy of the first vaccine that's really been trialled so far is so exciting, and I think there's every hope to believe that this will begin to allow us to use vaccines to return to some level of normality. But we mustn't take our eye off the ball. The virus is an RNA virus and is highly likely to change, and we need to keep a watchful eye out for that and be able to respond if necessary.
Wendy Barclay, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
Now, my final guest this morning is the Environment Secretary, George Eustice. Mr Eustice, can I start by asking, does the departure of Dominic Cummings mean anything at all for our approach to the trade talks?
No, our approach to the trade talks with the European Union have been led by David Frost right from the beginning. He's got a very talented team of negotiators around him who are leading on that, and they're all still in place.
So what does the departure of Mr Cummings and indeed Lee Kane from Number 10 mean for the way that business is conducted in government generally? Is there going to be any change at all?
Well, I mean, the Prime Minister obviously now has got three key advisors that he'll need to replace. Sir Eddie Lister has made clear that he wants to leave in the new year, so he needs to have a new Chief of Staff role. Dominic Cummings has departed, so he'll need a new Director of Strategy and a new Press Secretary as well. So obviously there's a lot of heat around this particular episode, but fundamentally what's going on here is some advisors have left and the Prime Minister will choose new ones.
Why do you think the Prime Minister finds himself in this position?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. First of all, I've known Dominic Cummings for 20 years. We worked together on the Business for Sterling campaign all those years ago. And he tends to, his great strength is in big strategic decisions, like whether or not we should leave the EU, like the 2019 general election. He's got many talents in terms of marshalling campaigns in these areas. That's his great strength. But look, as a year into the government, when we've got the pandemic to deal with, and that's been taken up a lot of time and energy, it's obviously right for the Prime Minister, should he want to refresh the team and change the balance.
You mentioned Brexit just now. If we don't get a free trade agreement with the EU, then British car manufacturers are going to face 10% tariffs. What is the government's modelling of the effect of that on the car industry in terms of lost income and lost jobs?
Well, there would be some impact from tariffs, but often it's quite modest. And I don't know, I haven't seen the modelling on automotive, but we have done modelling for this on food prices, for instance.
I'll come on to food in a minute, but the Society of Motor Manufacturers says it will cost the industry £47 billion over 5 years. That is 4 track and trace systems, to put it in simple terms. That's a huge amount of money. Is that modest?
Well, I think the point that I'd make is tariffs on industrial goods tend to be quite low. But look, we do want...
10% is huge for car makers.
Well, look, we do want to get a free trade agreement with the European Union, and an agreement could be done. We're not asking for anything remarkable. We're asking for an agreement akin to the one that they have with Canada. We're asking for something that's got a precedent.
And if you don't get it, does the government know how many jobs in the car industry are going to go?
Well, I think actually the car industry would adapt to this. They would change their supply chains. Some of the manufacturing that currently happens in the EU would obviously move to happen in the UK to support the supply chain and the automotive sector we have here.
So Mike Hawes, who's Chief Executive of the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, says a deal that failed to achieve zero tariff and zero quota trade would be the equivalent to no deal at all, devastating jobs and slamming the brakes on the UK's ambition to be a world leading manufacturer.
Well, it would be, it's correct that if we leave without a further negotiated settlement, then yes, we can expect tariffs on goods, but it's not the same as saying there'd be no deal at all, because of course we've already got the withdrawal agreement that deals with some of the tricky issues around Northern Ireland. And so
we're talking about a trade deal here, obviously. Now, you mentioned food and your own area, which is agriculture. Dairy farmers would face, if we don't have a deal with the EU, a 35% tariff. What's your estimate of the effect of that on dairy farmers across Britain?